Hello, everybody. I'm Helena Carbon. I'm honored to be the president of Just World Educational, a small nonprofit located in Washington, D.C., in the traditional lands of the Piscataways. Today is June 15th, 2022. Our guest today on this series on the urgency of banning nukes is Dr. Ivana Nikolic-Hughes, who is the incoming president of the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation. We're delighted that she made time to come and be with us today, because tomorrow she's heading for Vienna, Austria, where she'll be representing NAPF at the cluster of civil society and other gatherings being held around the first ever meeting of states parties to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, TPNW. And she'll be at the meeting of states parties itself. The TPNW came into force only in January of last year. It's great to have you with us, Ivana.
Thank you so much for having me, Helena. I'm delighted to be here.
This is the fourth public conversation we've held in this series. You can see the records of the previous three, which were with Ted Postol, Ray McGovern, and Vicki Elson, if you follow the link that is prominently on the homepage of our website, www.justworldeducational.org. Actually, I even printed it out. You can look at it here. Just note that the B of ban is in uppercase. Okay. I thought that was easier than doing screen share, to be frank. If you follow that link, you can also learn more about the upcoming sessions in this series, which will include two great conversations with people who will also be in Vienna for the TPNW meetings. And a special session we'll hold on the scofflaw role that Israel played in becoming a major nuclear proliferator and thereby undermining the whole value of the global nuclear non-proliferation treaty. Last weekend saw the 40th anniversary of the truly massive demonstrations held back in June 1982, in which more than 1 million Americans took to the streets of New York City to call for a total ban on nuclear weapons. Those demonstrations had real impact on our leaders. But after the Cold War wound down in around 1990, and the United States emerged as a unipolar global power, that mass movement of Americans calling for banning nukes tragically dissipated. At that point, leaders in the global South, like South Africa, Algeria, Costa Rica, and Bangladesh, and a handful of militarily neutral nations in Europe, led by Austria and Ireland, took the lead with strong support from a civil society network called ICANN. And in 2017, those folks finished negotiating the text of the TPNW and opened it for signature. As of now, 86 states have signed on to the TPNW and 62 of them have fully ratified it. Sadly, our country is not a signatory. I see our job as being to rebuild an anti-nuclear movement that's strong enough to push our government to sign on to this very important treaty, the TPNW, and to push for the total abolition of nuclear weapons worldwide. It's always sobering to remember that if nuclear annihilation happens, it will be a much speedier and more total form of annihilation than anything that climate change can cause. The Nuclear Age Peace Foundation is one of the stalwart organizations that, since its founding in that same year of 1982, has kept its eye firmly on the ball of nuclear abolition. I encourage you to visit their website, napf.org, to learn about some of their historic initiatives. It's because of NAPF's great record, and also because of her own great record as a researcher, activist, teacher, and leader, that I am really happy to welcome Dr. Ivana Nikolic-Hughes as our guest today. Ivana is joining the NAPF after 13 years as a chemistry professor at Columbia University in New York, where she has served as the director of the K=1 project, Center for Nuclear Studies, and will continue teaching there. She earlier won her BS in chemical engineering from Caltech and a PhD in biochemistry from Stanford. One of the key projects that Ivana undertook at Columbia was to take a group of students to the Marshall Islands, where the United States had conducted nuclear weapons testing from 1946 through 1958, drenching that archipelago with nuclear fallout equivalent to that from 7,000 Hiroshima bombs. She and her students and colleagues visited the islands twice to document the lengthy physiological, societal, and other long-term impacts of that testing, and to reach out to the Marshallese leaders to hear what they felt they needed to repair and make reparations for that damage. Because of her work with the Marshall Islanders and other survivors of nuclear testing, Ivana has a keen awareness of the fact that abolition of all nuclear weapons is a key issue for the peoples of the Global South in particular. Our great project director here at Just World Ed, Amel Zaroug, will be leading the conversation with Ivana today, while I dip behind the scenes and do the Zoom teching. If you need anything from me, I'll be in the chat box. I hope we'll have a good time for Q&A after Amel has finished her conversation with Ivana. So Amel, over to you.
Thank you, Helena. It's really such a joy and honor to speak with Ivana today, just a few days away from the first ever meeting of states parties to the TPNW, or Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which you'll be traveling to very soon. And I'd actually like to get right into that. What are the issues that you hope will be tackled in Vienna next week?
Yeah, hi, Amel, and let me just, I thanked Helena, and let me thank you as well for this opportunity. I'm so excited to be with all of you, and really at this, what feels like a historic moment, just before the states parties meet for the first time to make a plan for how to take this treaty, which is now in force, and how to really take it to the next level of figuring out how we get exactly to that world free of nuclear weapons, which is Helena has pointed out, the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation has been committed to for 40 years. And so I'll just mention there are a number of things that states and organizations that have been working on these issues, they have been working on the treaty, have in mind for the meeting, but I will single out three issues that I sort of personally see as perhaps most important. The first issue is the issue of what's referred to as universalization. So what does it mean for, as Helena pointed out, 86 countries have signed, 62 countries have ratified the treaty. After 50 countries ratified the treaty, that's when the treaty actually came into force. So what does it mean to have over 100 UN states that have yet to ratify this treaty? And what's really interesting about this point is that you have a wide variety of countries that have not signed. And so how do you approach, for example, countries like our own country, United States, as well as other nuclear weapon states? How do you deal with the ones who actually have nuclear weapons? How do you deal with countries that host nuclear weapons? So there are a number of countries that don't actually have any in their own possession, but they host primarily weapons from the United States. How do you deal with countries, for example, that, and I'll just name the Marshall Islands because we've already heard a little bit, and I know we'll talk about them a little more, that have been affected by nuclear weapons testing, but at this moment, perhaps might even still have some concerns about how the treaty would affect them. So that's universalization. Another issue is how do you really go from where we are today, which is between, and I'll just give a kind of a brushstroke number, between 10 and 15,000 nuclear weapons in the world today, depends on how you count. And how do you go to that number of 0? So what does that entail in terms of cooperation, verification? How does that whole process work? And then the third issue, and I'll coming back to the Marshall Islands, but there are other places around the world, other countries around the world that were affected by nuclear testing. How do you deal with assisting victims as well as remediating the environment that was affected? And of course, there was nuclear weapons use in 1945, but then widespread testing around the globe, really, over a period of decades. So those are the three kind of, I would say, three big issues for the meeting.
Thank you. You mentioned the Marshall Islands. Could you offer us a bit of background on American nuclear testing there, like a timeline and sort of a sense of the scale of the testing?
Yeah, absolutely. So the United States, as I assume everyone on the call knows, the United States tested one weapon in July of 1945 and then used two weapons in attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, August 6th and August 9th. Absolutely devastating events. These tests, these attacks killed on the order of 100,000 people in each of the two cities and literally just flattened the two cities. These attacks, these bombs that were used had an energy yield of 15 kilotons. What that means, that's not the weight of a bomb. It means that you would have needed an equivalent of 15 kilotons of chemical explosives to actually get that kind of an explosion. And 15 kilotons is 15 million kilograms of chemical explosives. So you can imagine that that's a lot of chemical explosives that you would need to kind of cause an equivalent amount of energy. So the US, so this was summer of 1945, the very first test that took place in the Marshall Islands took place July 1, 1946. So less than a year later, the United States was ready to test new weapons and continued to do so until 1958 for a period of 12 years. And during that time period, not only did we test bombs that were similar to the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bomb in design, energy yield, and so on, but that energy yield kept going up. And at the same time, we were able to design a new type of bomb called hydrogen bombs, where the energy yield just skyrocketed. It was a huge jump in this energy yield. And in fact, the largest bomb that the United States ever tested was the Bravo bomb that was done on March 1, 1954. And it was tested in Bikini Atoll. And it had the energy yield of the equivalent of 1,000 Hiroshima bombs. So you can imagine this was an absolute monster. This explosion it produced a mushroom cloud that was 25 miles high. I don't even know how to think of, what it would mean.
It's a scale that's
right.
Unconceivable.
It's a scale that's unconceivable, that's difficult to imagine and appreciate. And at the same time, so it was so big that all of this radioactive material went into the stratosphere and then kind of got mixed in there and then sent essentially all around the world. Of course, the fallout and the kind of return of all of that radioactive material was greatest near where the testing was actually conducted. And so the fallout not only affected Bikini Atoll, but it also affected other atolls where people were living at the time with absolutely devastating consequences. So I'll just say one more thing. So for a period of 12 years, so Bravo was one of the hydrogen bombs. We tested other hydrogen bombs as well. But for a period of 12 years, it's as if the US had bombed the Marshall Islands with 1.4 Hiroshima bombs every single day. That's what actually happened. For 12 years, every day 1.4 Hiroshima bombs. It was absolutely, absolutely devastating.
So what are the consequences of that scale of detonation and radioactive fallout for the Marshallese and their environment?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And, we can talk, I could talk literally for hours, but I'm going to try to sort of focus my remarks on that immediate impact right when the testing happened. And as I said, people were living about 100 miles away is Rongelap Atoll, where a population was living at the time of the test. The fallout came down like white powder from the sky. Children thought that it was snow because, what white thing could be falling out of the sky?
Right.
By that evening, many people on Rongelap were sick. They had burns on their hair was falling out. They had burns on their skin. They were vomiting. They were feeling very, very sick. And it took about 3 days for the US to come and relocate them. Another atoll where people were living at the time about 300 miles away is Utrecht. And something similar happened there as well. And people were moved away also 3 days later, and then moved back to Utrecht, actually 3 months later, and people have been living there ever since. And Bikini and another atoll were actually both testing sites, and people were moved off of those atolls in order for the testing to happen. And there was a really kind of complicated history of when they came back, were sort of clean enough for them to be living there, whether they were moved again. So a really complex history. But the kind of the devastating thing is that to this day, radiation in the Marshall Islands remains. And we did, as Helena pointed out, we did a series of studies to look primarily at those 4 atolls. But there's no doubt, and that was just a matter of time and resources, but there's no doubt that other atolls a bit farther removed were affected as well. And our studies demonstrate that the radiation picture is really, really complex, but also at the same time, atolls like Bikini simply are not suitable for a population to be living there full time. I could go into a little more detail about what that means.
Actually, I'd love it if you could. I mean, how does one measure the impact of nuclear testing?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. There are really a number of different things you would want to look at. And we by no means did everything that's possible to look at, but I'll tell you a little bit about what we did. One type of measurement is called, you could refer to it as external gamma radiation. Turns out the gamma radiation is sort of like light. We get light from the sun, but gamma radiation is a type of light that has really short wavelengths and really high energies. And so it turns out it can attack our DNA, can attack our cells. And there is gamma radiation that comes to us from other parts of the universe. It's called cosmic rays. So there's some natural sources of radiation. And there's also, for example, where I'm now in New York City, there's sort of bedrock under Manhattan Island that has radioactive isotopes in it, which give off some gamma rays. And so, walking around, even a place like New York City, you're going to find that there's some gamma radiation, and you can detect that fairly easily with a kind of a Geiger counter type device. Now, in the Marshall Islands, so one of the things we did was to measure that external gamma radiation in the south of the Marshall Islands. So Marshall Islands is made up of 29 coral atolls. So in the south, we measured this background gamma radiation. It was fairly low. And then in these northern islands, we found that the values were very different. They differed between the different atolls, but for example, in Bikini, the values were up to 60 times higher than the average value in the South. So clearly, this was the natural sources had nothing to do with this. This was about radiation coming from the leftover testing isotopes and radioactive materials. But that's just one issue. The other issue is that you can look at the presence of these radioactive isotopes in, for example, soil, in sediment, and I would argue most importantly, in food. And food is really the one that's just a different, that sort of poses a different level of danger, because it's one thing to kind of be externally exposed to gamma radiation. And as I said, we all at some level are already. It's another to put in food that contains a radioactive isotope that then decays inside your body, sending out gamma radiation. And then gamma radiation is in your body, attacking your cells, attacking your DNA. Very different from external exposure. And in particular, I'm going to get up just a little scientifically technical. In particular, there are two isotopes, and scary words, but bear with me. I'm going to get to some familiar words. There are two isotopes. One is called cesium-137, and one is called strontium-90. Cesium-137 is chemically similar to potassium. And I'm sure you know when you eat bananas, you get your potassium, you get plenty of potassium. Turns out potassium is really needed by our cells throughout our bodies, in particular our brain cells. When they communicate, they actually use potassium. And so when there is cesium-137 around, for example, in the food, and you ingest it, it goes inside your cells and it sort of replaces the potassium that's supposed to be there. And then it's doing all of this damage. Because if it couldn't kind of get incorporated in your body, you would probably maybe somehow get rid of it and it would be out. But it plays a role. It plays this role of replacing potassium. Strontium-90 is the second one I mentioned. And strontium-90 behaves like calcium. And that you know as well, right? You know that your bones have calcium. And so strontium-90 will replace calcium, will incorporate itself in the bones. And so, for instance, strontium-90 exposure has been shown to cause things like bone cancers, cancers of the bone marrow, including leukemia. So very, very, very dangerous. And so these are the two isotopes that, for example, in the Marshall Islands, we've found are still around. And they really are one of the, I would argue, one of the main reasons why certain areas of the Marshall Islands should not be inhabited without further cleanup.
Thank you. And how do you measure the human impact of this level of radiation?
Yeah, so there's a lot of, in terms of kind of understanding, if I understand your question correctly, in terms of sort of understanding like what's okay and what's not okay, like how do you know what are the levels, the cutoffs? It's actually an excellent question, and it's even going to be a question that the TPNW will need to sort of wrestle with in the coming years, because the question is, what is safe, right? And so you can, in reality, the safe thing is zero radiation, right? But countries that have been impacted by various, in particular, radioactive accidents like Chernobyl and Fukushima, countries like Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, and Japan all have national standards and limits, for example, for presence of radiation in the food. It's really fascinating. The US FDA also has a limit, and the US FDA's limit is far higher than any of the national limits set by the 4 countries that I mentioned. Japan has the highest limit for cesium-137 at 100 units, don't matter, I'll just say 100 becquerels per kilogram. The US FDA limit is 1,200 becquerels per kilogram, so far higher, 12 times
And
higher. Yeah, go ahead.
why is that?
I would call it a very permissible limit. And I think what we're really talking about at each of these concentrations is an increased likelihood of adverse health effects. And I think that there's an assumption at the US FDA that whatever risk this particular concentration would entail is acceptable. But I'll also note that those national governments and European Union has their own limit, which is also higher than Japan. All those numbers stand in contrast with the limit provided by the International Physicians for Prevention of Nuclear War, who have a limit between 8 and 16 becquerels per kilogram, so far, far lower. And so anyhow, so how do you know if a place is safe? It's really delicate. It's really, one really has to think about a variety of factors. It could be that in one place, some of the values look good and others don't. For us, for the Marshall Islands, looking at the different atolls, I would say we kind of came up with a very complex picture where some of the atolls, for example, Utrecht, we really did not find evidence of elevated radiation, which to me is overall good news. I would add to that it was not such a comprehensive survey that I would just say, okay, we're done. There's no problem here. I do believe that it requires further work, further testing, but at the same time, it's so far so good. With Bikini, it was just a number of things were high, including this external background gamma radiation, including radiation in the food. And to me, there's sort of no reasonable conclusion, but the conclusion that Bikini must be cleaned. And that's one of the things that we've really been trying to push forward.
And have there been any efforts of environmental cleanup by the US government?
Yeah, no, that's another really, really excellent question. There actually was a cleanup conducted in Eniwetok. So I've been talking mostly about Bikini, but Eniwetok was another atoll where tests were conducted. And in fact, Eniwetok is where the US tested the first hydrogen bomb. And this hydrogen bomb, I described Bravo a little bit. This one was called Ivy Mike. And it was actually the very first design of a hydrogen bomb. And it was equivalent. It really was very, very big. It was the ultimate energy yield was 10 megatons. So that's about 700 times the energy yield of the Hiroshima bomb. But the bomb itself was like a 7-story building. So it was a very different design from Bravo. It was the bomb itself was a real monster. And so Eniwetok is where tests were conducted. And then from 78 to 1980, the US conducted a cleanup effort. And that cleanup effort, in some sense, what I could say was successful, because when we went to Eniwetok, those southern islands did have very, very low levels of radiation or no radiation above background. So that was excellent news. The problem is that when you do a cleanup, when you actually, collect all this radioactive material, you have to do something with it. And it turns out that the US appears to have done two things. One, which is widely known, widely accepted. They put radioactive material inside a bomb crater and then covered it with concrete and created a dome. It's called the Rooney Dome. It's sort of, I would say at this point, infamous. It also kind of represents the symbol of really the danger of both nuclear weapons and climate change, because the dome is under threat from rising sea levels and is therefore, really a huge, huge concern to the Marshallese. The second thing that the US appears to have done, according to some documents and according to some people who were involved in the cleanup, is to actually dump some of that waste in the Eniwetok Lagoon. So while what I said is people live in the south of the atoll, those islands themselves might not be showing increased levels of radiation. There still is sort of potential for danger, both from the Rooney Dome and potentially from radioactive waste in the lagoon.
So from that, what does accountability look like for nations like the US that have engaged in nuclear weapons testing?
Yeah.
And how does the TPNW address that?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. I'm sorry about the sun. The sun just came in. I hope everyone can see my face. Okay. Yeah, no, that's a really great question. And we have really been trying to kind of push the US sort of, unilaterally on a kind of, Marshall Islands to the US. And so I'll just tell you my personal opinion of what I think should happen in that relationship. Number one, I think the US should apologize to the Marshall Islands formally. I don't just mean like send them an apology note. I mean, the president, holds a ceremony in the White House, apologizes formally to the people of the Marshall Islands, to their government, and comes up with a series of steps that are both going to make what happened right and make steps to promise that something like this will never happen again. And an excellent, excellent model for how this could be done would actually be Bill Clinton's apology to the participants and descendants of people who were participants in the Tuskegee study. So I first and foremost, I think that's just, that's step one. That's just the beginning, right? I mean, you're mean to a child in the playground, and the first thing your parents make you do is say sorry, right? So to me, this is just absolutely step one. And then after that, yes, engaging in number one, comprehensive surveys. Our work is really one of the only independent efforts to ascertain these radiological conditions, but it's not enough. We're a small group. We were able to do a small number of atolls, even in those atolls, a small number of islands, limited measurements. The right thing to do would be to have a broad scale, large, comprehensive survey of all the atolls in the Marshall Islands, all the different kinds of things that could be measured, and really figure out where one would need to do further cleanup. And then when it comes to cleanup, my view is that there should be a call for proposals. We have so much technology development in this country, so many wonderful and committed engineers and people working on all sorts of things. I think some of them would love to work on, a way to do this safely for people involved in the cleanup. I always give this example of my little Roomba vacuum cleaner going around picking up some of my dog's hairs and whatever else she brings in from the park. And I just don't accept that in the 21st century, we couldn't come up with ways of cleaning up. And there has been, tragically, because we've had nuclear power plant accidents, but there has been technology development, and it's just not 1978 anymore. And whatever was done in Eniwetok could be done better. Now, all of that is kind of, what do I, as an American, as someone who's been thinking about this issue, think the US should do? What's wonderful and just super, super exciting about the TPNW is that the TPNW is going to actually have, it has Articles 6 and 7. This pertains specifically to victim assistance and environmental remediation. And so this is going to become, it already at some level is, we just have to get it to a point where it's taken very seriously, international law to assist victims affected by nuclear use and nuclear testing, and also remediate the environments that require it. And so the hope is that efforts like this will happen not just in the Marshall Islands, but really in all of the places that were affected by nuclear weapons testing. I'll just mention Kazakhstan, where the Soviets tested weapons, Republic of Kiribati, where both the UK and the United States tested nuclear weapons, French Polynesia and Algeria, where the French tested nuclear weapons, Australia is another place where several sites in Australia where the UK tested weapons. So there are a number of places affected. I would still say none as badly as the Marshall Islands. It was in the Marshall Islands, it was even, the most removed into the past, 46 to 58. French Polynesia was much more recently, 1966 to 1996. But still, what happened in the Marshall Islands was really, really quite unique. And so, yes, the TPNW is going to make it part of international law that these people and communities are assisted, and that their environments are remediated.
And as a nation that's been so affected by nuclear weapons testing, why is it that the Marshall Islands hasn't signed on to the TPNW?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And it's one that I've been in contact with leaders there for a variety of reasons. Even just a couple of weeks ago, we had the National Nuclear Commission of the Marshall Islands actually held a public hearing with our group where we spoke about our work. And that was really a wonderful, wonderful, productive discussion with a number of leaders as well as community members. And I haven't discussed this with people in detail, but I'll just share what my personal understanding is. So some of the language in the TPNW, the Articles 6 and 7 that I referred to on victim assistance and environmental remediation, some of the language there is, so there's language there that allows affected states to retain agency over their own and jurisdiction over their own lands, over their own people, over what actually happens to them. And so I think for the Marshall Islands, the question is whether that language that allows them to retain agency is the right language that makes it seem like it's their responsibility to clean up the US's mess. And so I think I by no means want to communicate that it's an unreasonable read of it. I think having been affected, I think they have every right to make sure that the treaty works for them, and that what is sort of expected of them is reasonable. And at the same time, I also think that it's really, really important that they do retain that agency, and that international treaties cannot just mandate other countries to come in and clean up something that the Marshallese don't want to have done. And so I think that's sort of where I'm guessing the conversation is going to be going forward. And I think for all of this, the parties, the states that are parties, all of the states parties, it's really going to be their job to convince, and as I refer to their, sort of different categories of countries out there who are not signatories, have not ratified the treaty. So to figure out how to work with each and every one country, or with countries that belong to these different categories, to make the treaty really universal and to make it work for everybody.
Thank you so much, Ivana. I'm just so grateful to you for sharing your time and knowledge with us. And I do want to make sure that there's time for anyone who's joined us tonight to ask questions. If you're in the audience, please put your questions in the Q&A box. And if there are none, then I will keep asking questions. But
thank you, Helena, for sharing all of those
yes,
links and pictures, and a very exciting chat as far as I can tell.
Well, I thought I loved the pictures, even that you had sent. So I did share a couple of those, and I tried to share as many relevant things as possible. Amel, if I could ask a couple of questions, just finish up with your questions, and then I'll come in, and anybody else who is in the webinar, if they have questions, if they could raise their hand, that would be great.
Helena, you can go ahead. I would like to share the map that I think gives a kind of good sense spatially of what we're talking about with the Marshall Islands, and also get a better sense of just the scale of these nuclear experiments, not just by the US government, but generally in the Pacific. But yeah, Helena, if you'd like to go ahead. I think this was just a really good
visualization. Oh, that is a great map. I love the orientation. I was like, Australia's all kind of set at one side, but yeah, it's a view from somewhere.
Yeah.
So that's great. And there's New Zealand, Aotearoa, nicely. So yeah, my question, Ivana, was you wrote an article about the CTBT, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, as being something that you want you want us to focus on getting the United States to sign on to the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. So I know there's a kind of a discussion amongst people in the nuclear abolition movement as to whether partial steps are worthwhile on the road to, signing on to the TPNW, or whether they're a diversion.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question, Helena. So we had been thinking about this issue of what do you do with the Marshall Islands, and as I said, I really do think that the first step is an apology. But I personally see, so it turns out we have signed the CTBT. Bill Clinton signed the CTBT in 1996. We just never ratified it. And right, we have this problem that you need 2/3 of the Senate to ratify an international treaty, which is going to be a problem for the TPNW as well, even if we, get some people to support it. That ratification step is really, really tricky, because as we know, we can barely get anything passed with 50.
Well, we just have to build a really big movement, right?
This is just going to have to be coalition building, period, right? But we just really felt with the CTBT, like how do you apologize? You know, I think of an apology as something where first I say sorry, and then I explain why it's not going to happen again, you know? And to me, ratifying the CTBT would be that second step of like, I really know I screwed up, and this is what I'm going to do to make sure it never happens again. So in that sense, and really just setting the TPNW aside for the moment, this treaty exists. Other nuclear weapon states have ratified it also. Russia has ratified it, you know, so when we, you know, if we want to say we want to work with Russia on nuclear weapons reductions, forget what's happened since the end of February for the moment, right? But let's assume that, you know, we get to that place, right? You also have to say, well, and we have also seen through the major international treaties. Of course, both countries are signatories to the NPT, but the US and have ratified it, but the US has not ratified the CTBT. On the question of whether you need any of it, right? If you have the TPNW, at some level, I'd love that to be the world we live in, right? And I certainly hope that we can get there. But you're right. The question is, you know, do you direct your energies towards these partial steps, or do you really pour in all of your energy in the TPNW? The one thing I have been thinking about when it comes to these international treaties is that with the NPT, one of the things that has made, I think, the NPT so stale at this point, and you know, that word just came into my head, but I think it works. I think it's pretty stale, is the fact that there really isn't a time component to it, right? So there's this Article 6, and we're going to negotiate in good faith, and we're going to get rid of the, you know, nuclear weapons, and then we'll have complete and total disarmament. But it's all vague. There's no timeline.
And they promised that in
And they promised it.
1968, so that, you know,
yeah, it's
what
not
has
like they
happened?
haven't had time. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So from my perspective, I've been thinking, you know, for TPNW, if one wanted to put a date, right? To me, 2045 feels like a really good date. That would be 100 years after the end of World War II, 100 years after the first tests and first use of nuclear weapons occurred. I just feel like, and it's plenty of time. It's 23 more years from now. It's plenty of time to get there. And I think we should be saying 2045, no nuclear weapons. I think that should be, but yes, in the meantime, whether you pursue or whether you sort of give up the US Senate for the moment and just try to get to a place where so I mentioned in our conversation just before we started that I saw Bob Richter's In Our Hands film, and we saw it just a couple of days before the 40th anniversary. And it was so inspiring. And, you know, it's made me wonder about what it would take to kind of get back to those grassroots origins of the nuclear abolition movement, right? How do we bring it really to the masses? And what was so phenomenal, I think, about the rally, and of course that's depicted in the film. And by the way, the film is available on Vimeo if anyone, for free, if anyone wants to watch it. What was so fascinating to me was just the sense of unity. You know, there was unity between the protesters and the police. There were people of all ages, all colors, all kind of, you know, there were people who were talking about being, you know, devout Christians versus, you know, atheists versus, I mean, anything and everything you can imagine. All of America was represented. And I really feel like one of the big challenges for the movement has got to be some return to those grassroots origins.
Yeah, that's what we're hoping to build educational resources to try to get there. Amel, do you have any more questions for Ivana?
We actually have a question in the Q&A from Erika Huerta. Who said, hello, thank you for this talk as it has been very informative. I did have one question. How has the K=1 project worked in collaboration with groups in other countries, nuclear weapons, working towards similar goals, and what do nuclear disarmament efforts look like there?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So we have really been, we sort of started K1 project started, and when I say we, I'm actually moving on from that position to NAPF, but so it's a kind of a big we at this moment. The goal really was initially to sort of educate Columbia students on issues, and then through that education to have them be able to impact young people perhaps throughout the country and throughout the world. And then we sort of in that process of kind of recognizing nuclear weapons are a threat, young people aren't necessarily engaged in the topic. We sort of then kind of stumbled upon different projects, and that's how Marshall Islands became a focus of our attention. It really has, we've really kind of tried to, build community at Columbia through a variety of both, summer programs as well as courses, lectures, events, and so on. But yes, I mean, the next step, and I think for me at NAPF, will be really just that kind of cross-sectional work of trying to bring young people together, whether from different campuses around the US or from around the world. There's also someone who works with NAPF, and his name is Christian Ciobanu, who has also been running a sort of youth initiative called Reverse the Trend. And they're going to Vienna with a number of students. And in fact, when I arrive in Vienna at 12 noon, I'm gonna have to somehow make it from the airport to a youth orientation for NAPF and RTT at the Irish Embassy. And so I have 3 hours to do that.
Well, that sounds pretty exciting.
Yeah, it's gonna be, yes, it's gonna be very exciting. But yes, one of the things I would say, of course, the pandemic has been so challenging in so many ways and for so many, and of course, most challenging for people dealing with loss and poor health of loved ones. But on the other hand, it has sort of brought us together in ways that perhaps we didn't know we could, have prior to the pandemic. And so I've been actually in many Zoom events where people were logging in from all around the globe, including many Pacific youth who are really, really engaged in this issue, because this is close to their hearts. This is close to home. This has affected their families and their own lives, and they really, really care. Same with people in Japan. There is really a very strong nuclear disarmament movement there. And of course, the sad thing is Japan has not signed or ratified the TPNW. And I do hope that changes in the future.
Oh, Helena, you're muted.
Sorry. Yeah. I have the seed of a wacky idea, but I think it's one that might be worth pursuing. And that is to problematize the use of the term bikini for cute little swimwear.
So I'll tell you, and very few people know this story. Bikini, the swimsuit, was designed by a French designer in 1946. He named his design Bikini after the Bikini Atoll, not because it was a beautiful Pacific island and atoll, but because he wanted his design to be explosive. He
I
named
know it's out. I read that
it's
story.
outrageous. It is outrageous. It is outrageous, and it has stuck. And I have spoken to so many people who speak different languages, and I have yet to find a person who doesn't tell me, oh yes, of course we use the word bikini. Every single human language appears to have the word bikini for the swimsuit in their vocabulary. And it's devastating, actually. It's such a, and you know, another cultural reference is SpongeBob. So SpongeBob is from Bikini Bottom, that refers to the lagoon of Bikini Atoll, Bikini Island, and no one knows. Kids love SpongeBob, and they never know that we, you know, use 1.4 Hiroshima bombs every day for 12 years in the Marshall Islands. It is I have 3 children, but my middle one is just finished his AP US history course. And of course, they talked about the Cold War, but they never talked about the Marshall Islands. And the fact that we don't teach this in our schools, the fact that we don't talk about it widely, that these are not kind of widely known facts, is really, I think it's really criminal, actually. We owe those people so much. And at least we could remember, we could acknowledge and teach that history.
So we have a question from Jean Ramsbottom. Amel, do you want to ask this one, or shall I? You.
I can do it. I understand today's nuclear arsenals house 700 to 800 kiloton missiles. How many of these, if exploded by design or accident, would create a nuclear winter worldwide?
Oh, that's a really good question. Yeah, I mean, I would have to look back at that paper. There was a paper written in 1980 on nuclear winter. It was a Science magazine article, and this essentially came after scientists sort of figured out that the reason the dinosaurs went extinct, or most dinosaurs went extinct 65 million years ago, was that the asteroid hit the Earth and essentially created unlivable conditions on the planet, because there was so much soot and so much kind of debris that went into the atmosphere. It blocked the sunlight for a number of years, and that stopped photosynthesis, stopped food production. And so anything kind of bigger than a mouse, essentially, or a rat died out. Just couldn't, there was not enough food around. And so at that time, people realized, like, oh, wait, this could also happen if you use enough nuclear weapons. I don't know what the exact number is, but to me, there's a number at which whether or not we actually reach that point of nuclear winter, if you had 10 of those 800 kiloton bombs, in every which direction, I think civilization as we know it is not going to recover. I think it would take a very, very, very long time for civilization as we know it to recover. And if we really did get to a level where it's nuclear winter, then forget it. It's that's it for the human species. And as Helena said, it's in science, there's something called phase transition, right? So we all know, like, water can be liquid, right? And that's very different than when it's in solid form as ice, and it's very different than when it's in gaseous form, right? Where we sort of can't really see it, but we know it's there. To me, nuclear weapons are like, the use of nuclear weapons would lead to a phased transition in human civilization. It would just be a completely qualitatively different world. And that's a little different from climate change, where we sort of have this gradual change. And yes, we could reach a point where so much change has accumulated that we do reach that phase transition. So I'm by no means trying to minimize the problem. It is an enormous problem, but nothing threatens us, as Helena put it, so fundamentally and so like in a second, right? The climate change impacts are not going to happen in a matter of minutes. They could be very bad in a matter of minutes, someplace where, wildfires happen or some huge storm comes in, but that's still going to be a local impact. This is going to be, if there are nuclear exchanges, if it's an ongoing nuclear thing, it's going to affect the entire world. No doubt about it.
Yeah, I think in connection with that, and you're describing it as a phase change, I think one of the kind of rhetorical devices that's been used in this country to kind of sand away at the edges of that concept is the use of the term weapons of mass destruction, as though, chemical weapons, nuclear weapons, biological weapons, cyber, they're all kind of the same.
Right.
But actually, chemical weapons are horrible.
Right.
I mean, I have friends who are survivors of Saddam Hussein's chemical weapons attacks in northern Iraq. I don't minimize it for a moment, but still, it's, as you said, it's sort of localized. It's not the whole of civilization as we know it.
Yeah.
And so, all this concern that there's been in the US regarding Iraq or other countries, they're getting weapons of mass destruction.
Right.
But hey, let's look at actual nuclear weapons. Let's look at the nuclear arsenals that exist.
Yeah. And I'll just add, Helena, to that to me, the US really bears the most responsibility. We do have a similar number to the number of weapons that Russia has, and that's fine. We are still the ones that developed them first, that tested them first, and
that has used them.
Most importantly, that actually use them on civilian populations, on cities where this was a war crime. This was not, in alliance with the Geneva Conventions. This was not about protecting civilians. There was nothing about protecting civilians when you were willing to unleash these deadly weapons on people of a city. 100,000 people in Hiroshima, about the same number in Nagasaki. It's just absolutely devastating. So I really do think that we bear a special responsibility, and that we should, in some sense, be leading these efforts to get rid of nuclear weapons, not, standing in the background and wondering when the activists were going to go away, right? And I think we all should be demanding this of our own government. We should be pushing this issue. It really is, and again, just to bring in the Ukraine war for a moment, I think some of us who are aware of the dangers, I think I was like just frozen for days when the war first began, just terrified of where this is going to go, given the fact that nuclear weapons in fact are in play, and in fact are on submarines and in silos and deployed, and all kinds of things are out there, and it's very, very dangerous.
So Amel, do you have any more questions for Ivana.
Well, I know that you've just returned from French Polynesia, and I'd really like it if you could take a moment to kind of, tell us how did American and French nuclear testing in the Pacific, differ, compare?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So first and foremost, the time periods don't even overlap. So Marshall Islands testing was 46 to 58. The French started testing in Algeria in 1962, if I'm not incorrect, and then by 66 they moved to French Polynesia, and it lasted 30 years. Based on just the number of tests, Marshall Islands had 67 tests and French Polynesia had 193 tests. In the Marshall Islands, all of the tests were atmospheric. In French Polynesia, only 46 tests were atmospheric and the rest were underground. France was actually the country of the 5 nuclear weapon states, so the ones recognized by the NPT, so US, Russia, China, United Kingdom, and France. France is the only one that kept testing in the atmosphere after 1963. So 1963 was the atmospheric test ban treaty, so the US stopped, Russia stopped, the UK stopped. The French kept testing in the atmosphere until 1974. The French in French Polynesia, so French Polynesia consists of hundreds of islands, and they did test weapons in 2 atolls, which to my understanding were not populated immediately prior to the testing, nor does it appear that they were ever populated before. And yes, there was fallout from French nuclear tests that reached populated islands, but it was nothing like what happened with Bravo. It was nothing like visible fallout falling, on people on an island. The total energy yield for France was, I want to say, about 10% of the total energy yield of the Marshall Islands. So even though they did test some hydrogen bombs, they simply were far less powerful. So there's some, they're kind of pluses and minuses. The French clearly tested, I mean, they stopped testing just 20 plus years ago, and so they certainly kept testing far too long, but they did make some decisions that I think were a little better. Now the US always says we didn't know and we didn't know and we didn't know, but that's kind of easier to say. And there is, even with something like Bravo, there's some historical evidence that really they actually did know that people would be in harm's way.
And in the case of, can I go ahead?
Yeah, just quickly though, because
Okay.
I just saw the time. We need to start wrapping up soon.
Yeah, I mean, in the with both like French and American nuclear testing, did communities need to be relocated, and have they been able to return?
Yeah, so for for Polynesia, no, nobody was relocated. People kept living where they were living. Gambier Atoll, where we had a group go just a couple of weeks ago, that island, Gambier group of islands, they actually had a cluster of thyroid cancers. Now, I was talking earlier about some different radioactive isotopes. There's one radioactive isotope that's really critical at the time, like right when the test is happening, and it's called iodine-131. It accumulates in the throat, in the thyroid, and causes thyroid cancer. But that radioactive isotope doesn't last in the environment very long. It might be around for weeks, you know, or even just a few months, but then it's gone. So, you know, 30 years later, you don't worry about iodine 131 at all. It's completely, you know, it's completely gone. But at the time of the exposure, and now these cancers don't show up, you know, the next day, they take a while, but there has been a well-documented cluster of thyroid cancers in Gambia.
So what a fascinating conversation. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to break it off here because I just saw the time a little earlier. And I really, my deep thanks to both Ivana and to Amel, because clearly the two of you and I could go on talking for a long time about this. I am learning so much from you, Ivana. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you both so much for having me. This has been really fun.
So just before we close down, I got a couple of quick housekeeping notes. First, I'd like everybody to remember that Just World Educational is completely reliant on grassroots support to keep our cutting edge programming going. We recently did a great project on Ukraine, and if you go to our website, www.justworldeducational.org, you'll find out about that. If you haven't donated to us recently, please go to the donate button on our website where you can learn how to give securely, whether online or with a check through the mail. Second, please know that on Saturday, this Saturday at noon Eastern time, our guest will be Joseph Gerson. He's the executive director of the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament and Common Security, which is based in Boston. And he's vice president of the International Peace Bureau. Joseph is a veteran anti-nuclear organizer and writer and has just been at a key meeting in Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia, on the continuing campaign to build nuclear weapons-free zones around the world, which is kind of a complementary, or perhaps you can say it's a constitutive part of the idea of building a nuclear weapons-free world. Anyway, Mongolia is a key leader in that movement. Thirdly, please know that all the records of the conversations in this series are being made available in as timely a fashion as possible, and we hope you can share them with your friends and networks, especially next week when, you know, the TPNW should be, I hope, top of the news in all the main corporate media. And if it isn't, please write a letter to the editor and tell the editor that you want to learn about the TPNW. Anyway, for the moment, we're sharing the records of these conversations via this page, and we are also starting to build them into a new online learning hub on our website, which will join the collection of other great online learning hubs that we have there. Fourth, did I mention that all this work takes resources, and we'd love it if you could support us? Yeah, I think I did mention that, so that's not fourth. Anyway, it's really a sad moment to have to say goodbye to Ivana, because this has, you know, it's been such a pleasure to get to know you, Ivana, since we started planning this. And we send you off with all our love and best wishes for your safety as you travel, and to have a really rewarding and productive time at the meeting of states parties of the TPNW. We can't wait to hear your reporting when you come back, or maybe you could put some stuff on Twitter and we'll follow you on Twitter. And so thank you, Ivana. Thank you, Amel. It's great to be working with you on this project. And everybody else.
Thank you both so much. Thank you both so much for having me. And I had a great time and have really loved getting to know both of you. So thanks again.
Okay, so everybody join us on Saturday if you can. Thank you, everybody. And I'm going to close this out if I can just figure out how to do